Welcome back to our video lectures on the theme Antonio Rosmini, his economical thought and his relationship to ordoliberalism and social market economy. In the last video lecture, we thought about the libertarian radicalization of liberalism and noticed that ordoliberalism is an alternative way based on an analysis of the concept of liberty, which is a certain realization of liberty which is not identical with the libertarian foundation of liberty in a scientific way. We considered the a priority and the apories of this concept and this program of libertarianism, which led to the result that radical liberty damages itself. While this libertarian project leads to a subjectivation of liberty, liberty has to be considered as an a priori to subjectivity. Libertarianism didn't consider it an a priori to subjectivity, but it identified it with subjectivity, how we saw. Otherwise, liberty would result as absolute, and as absolute also in the damaging anatomy. So it is not methodological individualism, but the subjectivation of liberty by libertarianism, which renders liberty impossible in the political and economic system. This is without any doubt a very important result to which libertarianism, indirectly by its crisis, led. With this important negative result, it becomes clearer what the real aim of ordoliberalism in its reference to the liberal tradition is. With libertarianism, ordoliberalism shares the preoccupation that the wrong understanding of egalitarism in the liberal tradition leads to a totalitarian egalitarianism. This was the problem that Nozick perceived in Rawls. But even more radically, the thinkers of ordoliberalism saw this risk in the fragile institutionalization of liberalism at the beginning of the 20th century. This egalitarism, as Röpke argues, would be functionalist and controlled by its bureaucratic monstrosity, and therefore it would kill every natural and organic development in society. Röpke warns of the arrogance to the liberal rationalism that the liberating function of liberalism easily changes into its dissolving function, which in the end abolishes liberalism itself. And he continued saying, egalitarism, which is based on an atomistic individualism, may unavoidably bring, even if it targets only an equality of starting points, to the consequence that continued and centralized interventions by the government could seem desirable, which always correct from new the tendencies to disequality. In this way, it raises the risk of a total functionalization of society. If we reason that everyone has to be placed in that place in which he is entitled to because of his achievement, which always has to be confirmed and should be inserted in the social hierarchy, we presume a welfare state which differs from a totalitarianistic state nearly only in the name. This was the quotation by Röpke. It is obviously incontestable that the methodological individualism as ground principle of liberalism means egalitarism, but not a material egalitarism, but egalitarism in the principle of liberty. And this dimension of liberty as principle is the main argumentation of libertarianism and ordoliberalism. Against a materialistic misunderstanding of egalitarianism, libertarianism and ordoliberalism do agree. In this field, ordoliberalism tries to elaborate a concept of liberty which on the one hand respects the methodological individualism and its a priorism, and on the other hand would be able to found the principles of liberalism in a diverse way to libertarianism, in a way which creates a public sphere of liberty that is not the state, but legitimates in a minimal way its democratic and social institutions. This legitimation, which cannot be found on a principle which would be diverse from the individual liberty, is therefore a radical individual right-based legitimation. Only in this way, as libertarianism teaches, the justification can be considered fundamental. The position of Röpke, thus, consists in the argumentation that only the affirmation of the relational dimension of individual liberty can avoid two things: the atomization of society as a result of the subjectivation of liberty, that is libertarianism, and forms of liberal egalitarianism. This would be a result from classical liberalism. Röpke's approach is not a mere affirmation, but has a normative aspect. The social dimension of liberty is not merely the result of evolutionary processes, but on the contrary, such an affirmation would disqualify every theoretical concept of liberty. To sustain this dimension, a liberal night watchman state, which extremely can also be an unintentional result, is surely not enough. Röpke and the other thinkers of ordoliberalism insist on a strong, always vigilant state, which nevertheless does not interfere with economic logic. In this sense, Eucken affirms, what therefore should be the nature of state activity? The answer is that the state should influence the forms of economy, but not itself direct the economic process. State planning of forms, yes. State planning and control of economic process, no. The essential thing is to recognize the difference between form and process and to act accordingly. End of quotation. Social rules, in other words, do not only limit liberty, but they are a real precondition to the realization of liberty. In distinction to orthodox economics, Ordnungsökonomik, economics of ordoliberalism, in the tradition of Walter Eucken and the Freiburg School, analyzes not only the individual economic behavior, but aims at the analysis and explication of different set of rules. For Röpke, this means to combine two aspects. That is, the belief in the liberty of the markets and the insight that this liberty deserves extensive politics that strongly trace out the field of the economic liberty like a playing field, carefully defines her conditions, so to speak the playing rules, and guarantees respect to this framework of the market economy, of the playing field as well as of the playing rules with impartial strength. Liberty and bindings are combined to a specific synthesis, trying to find the social point that is guilting for one as well as the other principle. Aside to the trust in the ordinary force of free competition and free prices, stands the mistrust of the forces which try to abolish or to disturb this liberty, making disorder from order. From this derives the insight that the free market economy is the task of alert politics, which is aware of difficulty. But this free market economy could not be left alone after the removal of obstacles. This task presupposes not a night watchman state, but an independent as well as a strong state, a government qui gouverne. The state has to limit itself to the role as director and referee, and here it enjoys full authority, but should not play football at the same time. In other words, the market economy becomes, according to this new conception, an object of an everyday active politics. This allows to the representatives of the neoliberalism the right to refuse themselves to be confused with the philosophy of the laissez-faire, which was dead long ago. This long quotation was of Röpke. The ordoliberal thinkers, in other words, refer entirely to Kant and not to his individualistic Lockean reduction. To avoid this reduction, it can be sufficient to recognize that for Kant, in the original position, no liberty is yet realized, and that therefore the liberal rules within the civil condition are not only limitative, but also ensuring for the realization of liberty and dignity of the subject. Indeed, this second dimension is not realized by classical liberalism, and in modern liberalism it is naturalized to the individual property position. Classical liberalism is forced to trust in an ideal. The ideal that in a perfect natural development of social structures, perfect competition becomes fully realizable as the realization of natural law or as unintended results of intentional actions. Contrarily, the ordoliberalist theoreticians retain that this ideal is an illusory because it does not provide rules and mechanisms which could impede the formation of powerful positions that disturb the free exercise of liberty by all single individuals. Unlike the advocates of classical liberalism, said Müller-Armack, we know that the machinery of competition has certain deficiencies caused by imperfect markets, oligopolies and monopolies. Above all, the competitive order requires legal safeguards, making sure that the market parties do not destroy it by pushing it into an anti-market direction. In this way, having emphasized and stressed now the theoretical basis of ordoliberal thought, we have now to consider what are not only the consequences for the considering of economic institutions in the social context by ordoliberalism, but also to emphasize, and this is now the very object of this third lesson, where are the first common elements between this ordoliberal concept and the idea of Antonio Rosmini. To begin with that consideration, we have a quotation from Wilhelm Röpke, which is very, very Rosminian, which could seem indeed also an expression of Antonio Rosmini himself. Röpke said, "Society has its rights as they were individuated by the individual, but the exaggeration of the social rights in the collectivism is not less dangerous than the exaggeration of the individual rights, which would become in this extreme ends anarchy." We notice the moral dimension of balance, this moral dimension of balance, which is without any doubt distinctive element of certain conceptions which we can call conceptions of the third way. But this exclusion of both as exaggerations is not a planned design, but it is for Röpke as well as for Rosmini an ideal which has to be reached, but which we cannot say if it will ever be reached. It is a certain form of regulative idea in the Kantian in the Kantian sense. But what is affirmed in this sentence is that the social dimension of liberty is not contrarious to liberalism, but one essential element of liberty. Röpke says, not too much social elements, not too much individualism. And also, if the balance is a regulative idea, this affirmation says that in the theoretical concept of liberty, it has to be considered the dimension of relationship, the social dimension. It is an essential element of liberty. Only together with this element, individual liberty can be institutionally affirmed and guaranteed. Without that element, not only liberty is only half liberty, no, liberty cannot be guaranteed at all. Because without it, as the view of libertarianism showed, there would not be possible any affirmation of liberty. We end in the self-destroying paradox of liberty. The practical and concrete realization of this affirmation for the economical question is formulated again by Röpke. The economy of the market, as essential as it is, cannot be enough. It is important to raise some concerns which emerge on the outside of the problem of the economic order, which has to be resolved by the market economy. This economic order has to be integrated with others, which are larger and higher, and on which depends the success of the market economy, which they themselves presuppose. For this reason, in the name of the human being in its complexity and of the entire society, we opposed ourselves from the beginning to simplifications and reductionisms similar to economicism, utilitarianism, materialism, amoralism. End of quotation. To ensure liberty, liberty has to be defended not only by individual negative rights, but by a series of institutions which mark some limits to concurrence, as Einaudi said. He said, in the same way, democracy can be saved from the collectivistic crash only by building bastions around it, which restrain it and constrain it to look towards the anti-democratic institutions. Economic of concurrence can be saved only by putting chains and limits to the same concurrence. It is very important to remark that Einaudi did not suggest to impede concurrence, but to put limits to it. The clue of ordoliberalism, indeed, is that concurrence is a central and important principle. Therefore, it is a radical misunderstanding to read this affirmation as a plan to impede concurrence and competitivity and competition. But concurrence has to be evolved if it should be an expression of liberty in a framework of institutions and constitutional presuppositions. These presuppositions are indeed intended when Röpke defines a catastrophic error to consider the market economy or the economy of competition as something autonomous, which stands alone in itself, as a natural condition which has no need of help in assistance and defense, and puts the market economy outside of the political sphere. It was an error to neglect the decisive importance of an ethical and juridical context of institutions which would be appropriate to principles of the same economy. End of quotation. Competition and market order are not naturally given, as liberals said, and are not individualistically reducible like in libertarianism. Foucault gave a good summary of this swift of ordoliberalism in the liberal tradition, and he said, in this regard, ordoliberals break with the tradition of the 18th and 19th century liberalism. Why? because, according to them, when one derives the principle of laissez-faire from the market economy, one is basically caught in what can be called naturalistic naivety. That is believed that the market in any case is a natural given, something that spontaneously occurs and therefore that the state must respect, as though it were such a natural given. But according to the ordoliberals, it is here that Husserl's influence is easily recognizable. We are dealing here with naturalistic naivety. Indeed, what exactly is competition? It is surely not a natural given. Competition in its game, its mechanisms and its positive effects that are recognizable and evaluated is surely not a natural phenomenon. It is not the result of natural game of desire, instinct, behavior and so on. In actual fact, competition owes its effects solely in its essential nature, by which it is characterized and constituted. End of quotation. It is the liberty in human nature which is not simply given, but which has to be recognized in an order or framework. So, it is very important what Foucault said in this quotation, because the competition is not naturally given. Competition is, and that was stated by the ordoliberalists in a critical relationship to the liberal tradition, it is a form of human liberty. And as a form of human liberty, it is not natural in the sense of a nature process of development, a natural development, an evolutionary process. It is an a priori fact which has to be, in a certain sense, then socially guaranteed by institutions. It has to be formed. The human liberty is given, but in the social context. All the forms of the realization of liberty have to be formed by concrete institutions. And these institutions, if they have to be liberal institutions, have to be legitimized by the principle of liberty. This is the very project of ordoliberalism. Liberty is not a natural factor, as liberalism said, or a naturalized factor, as libertarianism said, but it emerges as a real human reality over the mere given factor of nature. This means the moral dimension of liberty. It is not simply given, and it is not simply individualistic. It is a duty for human being and a challenge to find the right institutional rules and institutions that liberty can be realized in a real, free way. In this sense, we find a very positive affirmation of competition also in Rosmini's philosophy of right. Rightly, the concept of competition has a real large and a real huge consideration in the philosophy of right of Rosmini. This consideration of competition in the philosophy of right of Rosmini, the institutional arrangements of competition, this has to be the point of departure of an analysis of the economical thought of Antonio Rosmini. In this sense, we find this positive affirmation of competition in the philosophy of right of Antonio Rosmini expressly in the affirmation of individual freedom against public oppression, and therefore in the same way that ordoliberalists intended the social function of competition. And now we have a long quotation of Rosmini which shows exactly the correspondence between Rosminian thought and the thought of ordoliberalism. Rosmini said, pure love of truth should lead us to confess that human rights in general have always been oppressed and unacknowledged. This came about because society or social government was always stronger than separate individuals. And by society or its government, I mean the majority of influential forces, if not always the majority of persons. It is indeed extraordinary to see that the remedy often proved much worse than the evil. Now and again, as oppressed individuals arose, people claimed to free them from oppression. Civil society, therefore, injures human rights in all the ways in which individuals injure another's rights. In all these various aspects, we find parallels between Rosmini and ordoliberalism. These sentences could have been written also by Eucken or Röpke. I continue. Hence, firstly, it injures the rights of freedom of particular individuals. Secondly, and Rosmini there has a list of 6 or 7 factors in which civil society injures individual freedom. I have mentioned here only 2. First, it injures the rights of individual freedom of particular individuals. Secondly, it simultaneously injures the right of freedom and of ownership by entering into the rights of lesser societies or of individuals and appropriating objects for itself, either A, through foolish pride, which under the title of public authority thinks it can achieve everything and uses this title to mask its injurities. This is a radical affirmation, which could also be a libertarian affirmation. B, under the pretext of its own advantage and the increase in common good, which cannot be promoted if it harms anyone. Common good as the motive for civil society, for the political instance, for government, to go inside to harm individual freedom, to harm the freedom of individual persons. So we see here that for Rosmini, it is not true that common good is the highest moral principle also for economic actions. No. Common good has its limit on the affirmation of individual rights. Otherwise, common good can be instrumentalized by political action. Common good is not in itself always a moral concept. I continue. Then after this was the end now. Then after considering further aspects of the public threatening of individual liberty, Rosmini precises that, and now I go on with the quotation, the question of free trade has scarcely been considered under this aspect of justice. Rosmini considers the question of free trade under the aspect of justice, not under a moral criterion. No, free trade itself realizes an aspect of justice, although it is the principal point of view from which it should be examined, if indeed it is true that justice precedes every other question and interest. Considered in general, competition through honest means in a natural right relative is a rational right relative to all kinds of earning. I repeat this sentence. Considered in general, competition through honest means is a natural right relative to all kinds of earning. Obviously, there is the moral relationship. Competition has to be based on honest means. But if it is based on honest means, it becomes a natural right relative to all kinds of earning. So we have not a direct deduction, a direct legitimation, moral legitimation of the institution of free markets, although we have this moral relationship. No one can prevent another from earning except by occupying beforehand through competition what the other would have earned. This is the principle of competition. To limit by an act of will alone others' freedom to earn, and in general their freedom to acquire some other good or occupancy, is an infringement of right, even if the limitation is supported with force. A private individual could not do this. The government therefore cannot do it in favor of an individual. Generally speaking, freedom of trade is founded in natural right, and therefore it is inviolable. This affirmation of Rosmini of the fundamental dimension of competition as realization of freedom, of dimension of justice in civil society, the relationship to a moral basis, but not its derivation from morality. These are all aspects in which Rosmini is much more close to the thinking of the ordoliberalism than not of the concept of civil economy. These and other aspects we will analyze in our next video lecture. Thank you very much for the attention.